And thank you so much for joining us. I am Keely Orgeman, the Seymour H. Knox Jr. Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art here at the Art Gallery, and I have the distinct pleasure of warmly welcoming all of you and introducing our speaker, John Walsh, for his third lecture in the four-part series looking at Mondrian, which is generously sponsored by the Martin A. Ryerson Lectureship Fund and the John Walsh Lecture and Education Fund. John graduated from Yale College in 1961 and earned his PhD from Columbia University. He held curatorial positions at the Frick Collection and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, where he was curator of paintings for 6 years. He went on to become the director of the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, serving in this role for nearly 2 decades. There, he developed the collections and staff, as well as oversaw the planning of the new museum building and renovated Getty Villa. John specializes in Dutch paintings of the 17th century and has written many articles, catalogs, and books. He is also a long-serving member of the Yale University Art Gallery's governing board. As my colleague Jessica Sack mentioned in her introduction last Thursday, John returns to the gallery each fall to help train our Wordle Gallery teachers in the skills of teaching in front of works of art. When I was a new curatorial staff member at the gallery nearly 15 years ago, I participated in one of John's training sessions. And for me, the experience was jaw-dropping. I don't know what just happened to me. I really had no idea what I was in for with that experience, but it truly affected me. To this day, I, like all of you, continue benefiting from John's incredible insights on the works of art in our collection, including those by Mondrian that are the focus of this lecture series. I encourage you to visit our third-floor galleries in the Louis Kahn building to see firsthand 4 of the artist's paintings on display. Today, John will speak on Mondrian's geometries. Again, thank you for being with us for this lecture, and please join me in welcoming John Walsh.
Thanks, Keely. Welcome to you all. In the previous lecture, we had arrived at this point, a painting that Mondrian made in Paris at the age of 47, roughly 2/3 of his career into it, and as radically austere in format as any work of modern art at the time. Mondrian had come a long way through a series of transformations that we traced in the first 2 lectures. We've looked at Mondrian's origins in the 1890s as a talented landscape painter with a solid academic training who'd made a local reputation in the conservative art world of Amsterdam, painting traditional Dutch subjects. He tried out one style after another, first symbolism that could be crisp or vague and spooky. For a time, he practiced a fluent, painterly kind of pre-impressionism. He painted large, moody, suggestive riverscapes with mystical overtones. He made startling experiments with the bright colors of Matisse and the Fauve group in Paris. And during trips to Zeeland in the summers, he tried out viewpoints and compositions of a kind never seen before. Cubism drew him to Paris for a couple of years, and there he evolved his own kind of cubism, morphing recognizable things, here the form is a tree, in stages, getting flatter and moving towards the abstract. Here it's the sea. Mondrian's radical translations of the incessant shifting of the waves in attempts to convey it abstractly. forms become rectangles, floating without gravity. Picture spaces collapse. And then he decides to use a regular grid to banish any impression of randomness in the composition. We looked at an invention of Mondrian's, a square canvas turned 45 degrees with two regular grids superimposed, which produces an experience of space that's disorienting. He experimented with this diamond or lozenge shape off and on for 25 years. In 1920, Mondrian returns to color and abandons regular grids. The colors are primaries, and the interrelationships of the shapes begin to embody what he called dynamic equilibrium. Forms are balanced but not symmetrical, and they're capable of shifting in our imaginations. His confidence grows. He finds that he can do very well with fewer, bigger shapes and more emphatic colors. We had a close look at a couple of paintings that revealed him as an entirely hands-on artist, not conceptual, not mathematical, but intuitive. He seldom knew when he began just how the finished painting was going to look, and most often made changes, big and small, as he worked. The previous lecture ended with this startling painting on the screen. Mondrian had traveled so far in 5 or 6 years working in Paris that he had the confidence to go to this extreme, reducing the composition to one vertical and one horizontal, and a tiny triangle of blue. You might ask, what is going on here? What, if anything, is this suggesting to me? Or maybe better, what might Mondrian wanted to suggest to me? This is a painting made to raise questions. The canvas is all white, 2 lines crossing, making that little triangle filled with blue. The horizontal line is a bit wider than the vertical one, and it's also shorter. So if Mondrian is so interested in balance, what's the situation here? Do we sense equilibrium? If we grant that lines have visual weights, would this structure tip? And if so, which way? I would say counterclockwise, but it's close. And anyway, isn't that dark little wedge a kind of chalk preventing rotation? Another question is, when the lines reach the edges and the artist cuts them off, where could we imagine them going? Now, with this painting, we don't need to ask. We can see. Nowhere. Because he stopped most of the lines before they got to the edge. He's asserting, I think, that the whole structure is contrived, contained within the painted surface. And the few lines that seem to be leaving are there to correct any assumption that there might be any 3-dimensional space and volume in the picture. It's arbitrary. This kind of ambushing your expectations is not new in art. This confrontation of Mondrian and Degas was made years ago by Meyer Shapiro to show that Mondrian had learned from the Impressionists that modernity consisted partly of surprise, unexpected croppings, like bad snapshots, displacing of the important things, the reflection of the hat in the mirror, by the unimportant, the back of the mirror masking the face of the saleslady. I think Mondrian is not just serving up playful ambiguity, though. I think he's not just baffling the bourgeois. I think he's making us work to discover that the situation he paints, 2 similar but opposing things, horizontal and vertical lines crossing and coexisting, can be 2 things at once. A self-contained situation on the one hand, or if we choose to see it that way, a fragment of a larger design whose extent we can't calculate. We don't have the melody, just a few notes. I'm going to go back for a moment 7 years to those first diamonds and this painting. Here, Mondrian began by drawing and painting a regular grid, and then another grid at a 45-degree angle, and then he added an assortment of rectangles on top with wider gray lines, and he tinted them yellow and gray. The composition and the colors were a dainty step towards the saturated primary colors that he was going to use in this diamond 5 years later, the colors that he'd adopted for the rectangles. He moved from one format to another, not in a straight line, but a back and forth, a series of experiments. There wasn't any pressure from the art market either, because despite being exhibited in shows, his sales in the 1920s and early 30s were pretty infrequent, and his prices relatively low. The diamonds, though, were the first to go to American buyers, by the way. In the mid-1920s, he made a few rectangular paintings on the model of the one that you see on the right, but in black and white and gray. And then in the following year, he made the extraordinary painting at the Museum of Modern Art. A white diamond with a gray triangle at the bottom. The lines have different widths, but their inside edges form a perfect square. That form is pushed a little off center, giving logic for the gray triangle. It's kind of weight at the bottom of a slightly tippy boat. I think that does work to create balance, and Mondrian would say dynamic equilibrium. By 1930, Mondrian is down to just 3 lines of different widths, vaguely structural, with a long horizontal doing the stabilizing on the left, a kind of crossbeam. At the right, the configuration might suggest a stick figure of a dancer at the bar, arms held wide. The diamond composition at the left is strange, too. It's here in the galleries, and I would like us to take a couple of breaths and just look at it. So 3 lines, again, all different in length and width. A horizontal line crosses the vertical one at the right, making a tiny triangle, not blue this time, but white, empty. The composition is the same as the Philadelphia painting that you saw, but flipped in mirror image. Plus, there's a heavy black vertical at the left. The side view, by the way, shows you how the stepped pyramid construction thrusts the canvas forward, and how the horizontal line at the very bottom stops at the edge, displaying the fact that the painted composition is only on the surface. The asymmetry is more explicit, and the whole thing feels more precarious. Speaking of precarious, I have to admit that for me, another image keeps coming up when I look at these pictures by Mondrian, with balance in mind. Famous tightrope walker and General Daredevil walking on air. You see, he was stabilized by that long horizontal pole whose weight and length provided inertia that steadied him. He's the very picture of dynamic equilibrium. Hanging near this picture upstairs in the gallery is another surprising bit of geometry, roughly 20 inches on a side, not including the frame that Mondrian put on it. And so let's just look at it for a moment. In the stack at the left, there are blocks of bright yellow and blue with a faintly blue block in between. A creamy, warm white block lies at the bottom next to a small, upright black block. It's an audaciously non-symmetrical composition. It's brought into balance by some subtle devices, mostly by the very large pale blue rectangle at the upper right, which we've learned might, in our imaginations, be the corner of a rectangle extending outside the frame. That suggestion, that ambiguity, is part of Mondrian's stock in trade, as you've been hearing. It's not white, it's a sort of pale sky blue, and I've got to confess that I wonder if it was just an arbitrary aesthetic choice for Mondrian that he put in that sunny yellow at the top and the deep blue at the bottom and the sky blue above and perhaps beyond. Did he mean to suggest the elements of seascape that enchanted him in Zeeland? Up close you can see how he painted glossy black lines, freehand, with great care, making small adjustments there and more. You can see at the very far right that the black bar is infill. It's painted over white, and that shows through the cracks. And you see long horizontal brush strokes in the smaller blocks, contrasting with the vertical strokes in the big sky blue block at the right. And if you were tall enough, you could look down at the top and see that he's put the canvas into a strip frame so that the painting projects forward, rather than being confined under the edges of a conventional overlapping picture frame. The strip was then glued to a flat backing board, and the whole thing is painted off-white. Here at the right is a variation on the painting, same size, 20 inches. The Yale blue is gone, replaced by a very pale blue block at the bottom left. The yellow is stronger, it's more saturated, the lines are thicker. There's less going on with fewer and subtler elements. You can see, I think, that the paint surface is wavy and cracked at the upper right, not flattened by a restorer later on by lining, which is what you hope to find. You hope you won't find the painting in a plexiglass box, which museums feel obliged to use to foil pointers or pokers, not including Yale, by the way. Here's the view from a gallery stool in good, even daylight, with just a few stray reflections. The light is a bit too blue at this hour of morning, but it warms up during the day at the expense of some of the cooler tints that Mondrian chose. The problem of seeing Mondrian the way he intended us to, when we're in front of the pictures, is often increased by museum lighting, which varies quite a lot. When we're seeing them in photographs, even good digital images, studio lighting often irons out the surface textures and the little fix-ups that Mondrian obsessed over, and you get something flat, like a poster. The one at the left was shot in the studio, no doubt for publication, and cropped to remove Mondrian's frame. It's so evenly lighted that even the small deformations can't be seen. It's had a kind of facelift, and it's the natural character of a 93-year-old handmade object has been lessened. Again, you can see how important the frame is, gently pushing the picture plane forward. Well, in June of 1930, in Paris, Mondrian had a visit from a fellow painter, Hilla Ribet, at the right. She's better known nowadays as the inspiration and the scout and curator for the man whose arm she's on, Solomon Guggenheim. She wrote this about Mondrian to a friend after the visit. He hardly paints. He constructs 2 or 4 squares, But he's a wonderful man, very cultivated and impressive. He lives like a monk. Everything is white and empty, except for red, blue, and yellow painted squares that are spread all over the room of his white studio and bedroom. He also has a small record player with Negro music. He's very poor, and already 58 years old, he resembles Kandinsky, but is even better and more alone. Moholy-Nagy loves him and venerates him in his quiet, intense way. I bought one of Mondrian's paintings for myself. Nobody will like it. A white oil painting with 4 regular lines. I love it, but I bought it in order to keep the wolf from the door of a great, lovable man. And this is the way to hang it. And then she shows how you hang it with the point down. A few years later, the Tate reconstructed Mondrian's studio, complete with mock-ups of some of the paintings and furniture and the famous color patches that Rebet mentions, and that Mondrian stuck to the walls and rotated from inspiration. Hilaire Rebet told Mondrian that he ought to let her friend Catherine Dreyer come and visit the studio. As it happens, she had visited it, and in fact, she bought 2 of the big diamonds, one, the one you've just seen, and the other at the Museum of Modern Art. And here's the painting that Hilaire Rebet bought for herself and eventually left to the Guggenheim Museum. Mondrian wrote her when he shipped it, "I hope that the picture arrives in good shape, but if it does get dirty, you can always clean it with a little water and white soap." The paint is thick enough to withstand that. A few months before, Mondrian had shown Rebet's new painting in an important group show in Paris that included 80 progressive painters and sculptors, including Kandinsky and the Arps and Léger. That group called itself Circle and Square, later Abstraction Creation, and Mondrian contributed an essay to the periodical. The blue arrow points to Mondrian in the back row. In the photograph below that are the entries he sent to the show, Hilaire Rebet's picture on top, and below it, a small painting of the same year. At times, Mondrian would come up with a composition that challenged him to do it again a little bit differently and maybe better. That little picture that you see on the screen had led to several more in succession. Here are 2 of them. In both, long lines form a cross. In the picture at the right, there are thicker lines, a bigger red rectangle, and some hefty extra support under the crossbar that holds up the red, even a kind of strut to the left edge. There's a lot of work, opposing forces, Mondrian would say, a lot of work to create the balance that you, or at least I, can sense in this composition. At the left, the balancing act is all the more deft, it may be even flippant. The horizontal line is a cantilever to support the red block, which is oblong, upright. You could even say more gracefully proportioned. At the other end of that horizontal, there's blue as a counterweight. In fact, the blue is part of the sort of mini structure that forms the quadrant of the lower right. But the blue disappears at the right edge. When you hear me keep using words like support and heavy and top and bottom, keep in mind Mondrian made these things flat on a table, facing up. But he was imagining hanging them on the wall, and so he would have given them an inspection on an easel between bouts of painting. Now I'm going to put some of these propositions to the test of playing a game with them, a game for you, that is. Here are 3 versions of a Mondrian composition: A, B, and C. Look for a minute. I'll show them to you one at a time, and then all 3 again together. And then we'll vote, or you'll vote, on which you prefer. Nobody's counting, by the way. So I'll be quiet for a minute. So the question is, which do you prefer? How about A? Raise your hand if it's A for you. Kind of a smattering. Let me just, yeah, a smattering. Okay. And B. Okay. 3 or 4 smatterings. And C? Whoa. Wins by a narrow. I just made that up. Nobody wins here. Maybe another question though to you: Are B and C equally balanced? Is there equal sort of what Mondrian called dynamic equilibrium? B and C. What do you think? The answer is, I see both heads like that. So yes, they're equally balanced. Raise up your hand. Raise up your hand. You're not counted if you don't put your hand up. Thank you very much. The question was no, not balanced, and yes for balanced. And there are a number of people who choose to not participate. I understand. Okay. How about A and C? Are they equally balanced? Have you reached equilibrium here? Yes or no? A few yeses. Many more yeses. And no. More no's, but they're more enthusiastic. The one that's actually by him is C, and the other one, A, is just a sneaky flipped C, and the B is invented by my friend John French, who can do anything with his PowerPoint, with his computer. So 2 have blue, 1 has red, have the same yellow, and yet I do think that each feels different, but they're pretty close in terms of the magic formula, the magic idea of dynamic equilibrium. Here's my own favorite upstairs. I was going to play a game with it too, but I realized that some of you would have unfair advantages and you'd run away with the game, so too bad. But let's look at it, and you could ask yourself, is there dynamic equilibrium here? Is there dynamic equilibrium? And if so, what do you do to make that? You don't have to answer out loud, but I'll try mine on you after a bit. Could be mine. Oh. Well, he did something relatively daring here. He made the red sit on top, hanging out a bit to the right, over a narrow strip at the right he creates by shifting that big white square with the yellow and the black base, moving that just a little bit away and towards the center. The blue and the black blocks are also elevated, they're supported, so to speak, by a white block, which has only 2 boundaries. The whole thing seems precariously balanced, definitely a case of dynamic balance, or at least dynamic forces. The big red hanging block suggests that the whole works might rotate, paradoxically, since the big square is not likely to rotate very easily. And you may be wondering, what about the title, Foxtrot? You've seen it used twice. Apart from being an enthusiastic dancer, why that step? It's another American import, the dance, but like jazz. But why this particular one? We need a 1-minute dance lesson with Leon and Kim, and we're going to have it.
Hello and welcome to this Passion for Dancing video. My name is Leon and assisting me is Kim. And today we're going to be teaching you the basic step of the foxtrot. Now this is one of the most social dances out there. You can use it in parties, weddings, and any other social events. Today we're going to cover the most fundamental basic step of the foxtrot. So let's get started. Okay, we're going to do it to my count now. And slow, slow, quick, quick, slow, slow, quick, quick. And let's do another angle. And slow, quick, quick, slow, slow, quick, quick.
I've come to love them. But I'm not going to play it again. I will instead show you this. Sorry. So why the foxtrot? Well, it's in the geometry. You notice it has no diagonals. They've been banished from Mondrian's aesthetic world. It's all back and forth and sideways, unlike the waltz of their parents' generation, not these people, but Mondrian's. Now, all his life, he's been a lover of rhythms in music, a lover of structure, of syncopation in music. They're a kind of life-giving invitation to get up and move with a woman partner, which he does in his own unconventional ways. The foxtrot in the 1920s in Paris was new and different, like his art, structured, sensuous in a distant sort of way, and not incidentally, it has no diagonals. Here's the artist, age 61, established but not very secure financially, greatly respected by other artists as an uncompromising, committed pioneer of abstraction, standing still and proud with his latest surprises. On the top, displayed at the height he prescribed for his diamond compositions, at the top is a new twist. The black lines that we expect, he painted yellow instead. And not canary yellow or police tape yellow, but a yellow with an ochre cast, giving the very different kind of emotional charge to the picture. The painting was commissioned by the City Museum in The Hague, the Gemeentemuseum, and it was paid for by a group of younger artists who wanted to honor Mondrian in its new building, a building that it was being built at that moment to designs by Mondrian's older contemporary, Hendrik Petrus Berlage. It built up the greatest collection of Mondrian's work anywhere, including the great bulk of his work before 1911. Mondrian was suffering from some chronic health problems. He had arthritis off and on. He had arteriosclerosis, frequent flu, and other respiratory problems aggravated by his lifelong devout smoking. There were emotional shocks that left him sad and lonely during these years, the death of his friend Theo van Doesburg, and a couple of broken romances with younger women in one case. In my suggestions for Mondrian readings in the gallery website, you'll find Hans Janssen's recent biography, which is full of vivid descriptions and scenes and conversations, some of them reconstructed, covering Mondrian's life and work in Paris. The painting, let me just go here. The painting underneath with double lines opens up possibilities that Mondrian is going to explore for the next 4 or 5 years. He freed himself from the austere geometries that had made him famous and let himself be a lot more adventuresome. His sizes are often bigger, too, with wide open spaces and bigger distances between the colors, and a familiar trick, unequal intervals that look regular but are not, complicating things. Formats become eccentric, too, tall and narrow, never horizontal, with, again, the color almost leaving the scene. And he's not consistent. He's perfectly ready and willing to revive intimate sizes and familiar compositional devices. This one is a child of the ABC composition, which we played with a few minutes ago, just 18 inches on a side, with a familiar, witty bit of business, that luminous little yellow box, like a soloist headed off stage, but still essential to the equilibrium of the whole composition. And it would be apparent to this, more familiar layout 2 years later, with thinner lines and substituting yellow where red had been. As you've seen, lines multiply, the compositions evolve in the 30s, and they create more complex relationships. When the lines are doubled, there are new variables. How wide? How widely separated should the pairs be? The double lines arouse more associations with the real world, too, especially with built structures. The first of these here at the left is intersected double line. It's actually a sort of golden yellow rectangle is placed on the double line that's intersected by a long, thinner vertical line top to bottom, where it meets an even thinner black line that functions as a kind of counterweight. In the larger and more robust composition on the right, the yellow block gets support from the girder-like double line underneath it, while there's also suggestion that the little blue form here at the bottom may be suspended. Mondrian can use a single color all by itself as a kind of stand-in for the entire spectrum. Sometimes that can strike us as an extreme of purism, and sometimes as wit. You know, how dare that blue be out there? It works because of the elaborate quasi-logical structure of lines, including a square in the bottom quarter that seems pretty sturdy. On the right here, the blue box is smaller, bluer, and it's crowded with, or by, vertical lines, as though the blue box had pushed them aside like slats. Hans Janssen, when he was a curator at the Gemeentemuseum, wrote this about the painting on the right. A number of relationships, he wrote, are at work. Planes becoming lines, and lines becoming planes. Grids sliding over other grids. Grids evolving into other grids. Grids refusing to become grids. The three closely packed vertical lines on the right are all equally narrow, but in combination with the adjacent white fields of varying widths, they appear to be different in size. The single blue plane, which I've called a box, works like a lifebuoy, a beacon, guiding the organization of the entire image. An entire large white square in the upper half of the painting is a final echo of the classical style with which Mondrian had been preoccupied for so long in the late 20s and early 30s. The difference between it and the work of 10 years earlier is the huge increase in the power and heterogeneity of the composition, and the growth both in the numbers and the directions of viewing and the rhythmic elements, while the image as a whole remains impenetrably real. I think my favorite of these is the one at the right, which you have to go to Venice to see, unfortunately for you. The same large size as the Wadsworth painting on the left, but now the lines are thicker, not all consistently so, And they create two zones, vertical and horizontal, that give you a first impression of being superimposed. And then you have a double take when you see that the main horizontal bisects everything and creates a double line partway through. And in this severe arrangement of black and white, this bit of red is permitted to peep up. The painter Max Bill saw this picture in 1938 and described it as having not only a red bit, but also a tiny gray area at the upper left, way up at the top. When Peggy Guggenheim asked Mondrian 4 or 5 years later to clean the painting, Mondrian did, but he painted the gray patch out. These alterations went on all the time in the studio, not just before the pictures were exhibited, but afterward too. They were part of the artistic process. Mondrian made his moves intuitively, insisting that his compositions were not calculated, but instinctive. Here's a case you saw a moment ago. The painting in Hartford, and a photo of it at the right, taken more than a year before. It shows that Mondrian repainted his double lines to space them out, and the two little horizontal bars near the bottom became a single wide one. We also have some unfinished paintings from these years. Here's a small one with lots of charcoal lines in different configurations. Having made the choice you see, he would have given the white and yellow areas more coats of opaque paint to have made his charcoal experiments disappear, in other words. We don't know why he didn't in this case. Maybe it just didn't feel it was promising enough. When colored rectangles like this blue one here are traversed by black lines, there's a hint sometimes that maybe space, the illusion of space, might have crept in. The blue might be behind those bars, in other words. This one he entitled Rhythm in Straight Lines, a signal that these intervals are organized in the way time is in music, regular but sometimes syncopated or slowed or accelerated by the musician playing the music. In the year he began this picture, 1937, life in Europe had become ominous, especially for advanced artists. Hitler had become chancellor in 1933, then dictator. And it was increasingly obvious to everybody that Nazi Germany would soon be seizing territory, even before the invasion of Poland and the annexation of Austria. In Paris, Mondrian heard reports of modern art in German museums being seized by the Nazi because they were ugly or obscene or subversive, or because they were made by artists who were Jewish or mistaken for Jewish. This was an official process based on official anti-Semitism and carried out with state power and very efficient record keeping. So-called degenerate art was taken from museum walls and exhibited in various cities, mostly notoriously in Munich in the summer of 1937. There were works by many great German expressionist painters and sculptors, and by other Europeans whose work German officials could call deviant, or impure, or the worst, experimental, suggesting subversive. The exhibition included two paintings by Mondrian, in the upper left, that Nazi officials had removed from the museums in Hanover and Essen. In Paris, his British artist friends, Ben Nicholson and Barbara Hepworth, were getting ready to get out of France and return home to England. For much of 1938, Mondrian prepared to do the same, not back to Holland, but to England, and maybe on to New York, where he really wanted to end up. So he packed up. He gave his jazz records to a friend. He assembled, oh, hello. He assembled his studio gear and a couple of dozen unfinished paintings and a single suitcase. And then he crossed the Channel. In London, his friends helped him find a room and a studio in Hampstead. During all this turmoil, Mondrian's work got more and more exposure through dealers in England and in New York, and his sketchy finances improved thanks to advances from dealers and collectors. But conditions in London were dangerous, and during almost 2 months of the Blitz, sometimes terrifying. He kept painting and writing. He was working to get friends to pull strings so he could sail for New York at last. And after the German raids stopped, and after more delays until May 1940, he was able to get on board the RMS Samaria, which was a cruise ship converted to a troop carrier, and sailed from Liverpool in a convoy that was threatened by German U-boats. The voyage took 11 days, all of which Mondrian reported he spent on deck. Once landed, he got help from a young American painter friend, Harry Holtzman, who'd arranged for his visa and found him an apartment. And he later became Mondrian's executor. Mondrian had bought paintings with him that he had begun in Paris and London, and he reworked many of them in New York. He gave several of them titles that were a sort of homage. He entitled this one, Place de la Concorde. The colors came from the same repertory as before, but now he used them to make short bars of blue and red and yellow, as well as big blocks of them. The sense of syncopation, I think, is stronger. And there's a kind of amplitude, a kind of, and also energy, a kind of exuberance that I think everybody senses. Here's Trafalgar Square, 5 feet high, where the excitement is again at the bottom. The black lines are heftier, and the colored lines are little squares. The whole thing has gained in clarity and force. Now, here's another test for you, the last one, I promise, a real-life one. Long after he got to New York, Mondrian discovered a shortcut for the fussing he'd been doing to adjust his compositions, and a way to test painting colored lines instead of just black. Colored lines. This was a commercial tape. He colored tape. He could buy it in Mondrian colors. The close-up of a finished painting here shows you what it looks like. It was quick to put on, and you could cut and patch it quite simply. And then, when he felt the composition was okay, he could peel it off and paint where the tape was. So here's the other side. Here's that's a detail. Here's the painting, and here's the test. Which way is up? A or B? Some of you know this is a real life dispute going on. I'm going to poll you in a minute, and I'll send the results to Dusseldorf. So wait a second. Look at them, please, and I'm going to ask you again, A or B? Okay. Votes for A. Okay, about a third. And now, hands down, please. Votes for B. Oh my God, it's a well, I think I should tell you, A is the way it's been hanging. For very many years, and I don't blame you for finding it. That's a good call. But some of you may remember that there was a lot of press coverage last fall when the curator in Dusseldorf went public with her opinion that the painting had been hanging upside down all these years. It should have been hanging, says she, it should have been hanging like B. Yes. She showed, and why did she say that? Well, she showed a fashion photograph on the right, taken in the studio after Mondrian's death. And there it is in the back of the woman dressed in fashionable black. There it is on the easel in position B. So there was a lot of mockery of art experts in the press, mockery of abstract art too. Schadenfreude. But there's a couple of reasons why the curator's conclusion isn't so simple and might be wrong, actually. The fashion shoot was 8 months after Mondrian's death, and in between, things were moved around in the studio. Just which things, we're not sure. And what's more, Mondrian himself sometimes put unfinished paintings on the easel upside down to study them. And so the debate continues between between the blinds down and the blinds up faction, to the amusement of art world skeptics. We are coming to two really quite wonderful last works painted in the last 2 years, the 2 years before Mondrian died of pneumonia in New York. The one he didn't finish is this one, and it's now in the Kunstmuseum in The Hague. In New York, he was finally in boogie-woogie country, having heard the music in Paris, having collected his records, having often been out dancing in clubs with friends, as you heard in the last lecture. He was hearing it almost as soon as he got to New York. It was an outlet for Mondrian, jazz was, and also something he could give his theoretical approval to, because its method was similar to his own. In his word, destruction of melody, which is the destruction of natural appearance, and construction through the continuous opposition of pure means, dynamic rhythm. Now, that doesn't sound like a guy who's having a real good time, but he's got theory behind his dancing, and you'll hear where that leads. Anyway, dynamic rhythm, I think, is what this painting has. There's a beat in the lines. There's a beat in the lines now, the little squares of different colors making for a staccato rhythm. Placed behind the lines are bigger squares of yellow and red, some on the beat and some off. Apropos boogie-woogie, the painter Lee Krasner took Mondrian out to a jazz club in Greenwich Village, and he told an interview later, she said, "I'm a fairly good dancer. That is to say, I can follow easily, but the complexity of Mondrian's rhythm was not simple in any sense. No matter what the music was, Mondrian danced in a staccato manner, with his head thrown back. It seemed to me his movement was all vertical, all up and down," she said, though she conceded maybe I'd been too affected by his painting before I met him. Finally, the most famous of his paintings, which he finished just before the previous one. It's calmer and more measured, I think. Everybody who looks at it, I think, sees and feels the grid of the city, the stop and start of traffic lights and traffic at the intersections. There's some pulses that get into your life. There are reds and yellows, notice, but no greens here. I've noticed that people spend a lot of time in front of this picture. I've eavesdropped and I've heard bits of conversation. Often, what's your favorite spot in the painting? I've wondered about that too. The clusters here and there are pretty great. Some of them, these clusters, look like they might secede and go off and be independent paintings on their own. Here's an eyewitness in December 1942, a New York painter and writer and a friend of Mondrian's called Charmian van Wiegand. She said, he's taking off the tape and painting in the little sections. All the lines have been broken into what now becomes a rich and encrusted ornament that is as glowing and deep as enamels. The rhythm is strange, so dissonant, so extraordinary in its vivacity, without being dramatic, lyrical, or monumental. Now, I think there is joy here in the whole composition, and all the more because you see Mondrian's hand at work everywhere. You get involved with seeing little irregularities, tiny slips and fix-ups, finding gnarly edges and a surface that's wizened in places. You get involved. Involvement, I think, is part of Mondrian's gift to us. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to look again at what Mondrian hoped he could accomplish, and what he did, and what he chose not to do, and what his contemporaries were doing, and what the consequences were. So that's it for today. Thank you for your patience with the game show. Cheers.